Hi guys, and welcome back to askNK. So today's video is to address something that I've received a couple of times as a request, and this is more like a video because I don't really know the exact platform who or the people asking are using, so I'm just going to shoot at random and also use as much apps as I can to explain it. And we're talking about using scatter. So scattering stuff around your scene can, greatly increase how much you can get assets or other things to display around your scene. Other things that you can actually benefit when you scatter stuff is instead of manually picking and dropping things around your scene, you can simply just create instances and automatically it's going to get those things done for you. So the apps which we're going to look at today and how you can scatter within these apps by default without any use of plugin would be Houdini. We're also going to use Maya, Cinema 4D, and Clarisse. So if you're using 3D Studio Max, you can also use the same idea and play around with it. You can use the particle effect. For now, I don't have it installed on my computer, and that's why I cannot show you with that. For what we have, I'm going to show you how you can use your node to actually get that done, how you can use layers, how you can use stacks, and how you can go ahead and use maybe apps that don't use any of these things, and you can get it done. So starting off, we're going to go ahead and use Houdini. By default, if we just come through and just simply create a box, we can have a box here. All right, and you have to jump right into the box. So this is more like your surface operator, so you have to go inside the box. Think about it like your directory. Okay, so you have to go right inside the box before you can create anything you want. Then the next thing which we want to do is we may want to create a sphere. So I'm just going to use something very basic, something like this, to explain all of this, and I might set this to mesh. If you're using Houdini for the first time, what you're going to notice is we cannot see the sphere. So how we can see a sphere like this is you need to turn on this flag so we can see the sphere, or you can turn on the flag here and you want to see this. If you want to see the both of them at the same time, you need to be able to add a merge node, and the merge node is basically what it does. It just merges two nodes together. So you add a merge node and now you can see the both of them together. If you want by any chance to move your objects around your scene, you can do that by just simply pressing tab on your keyboard and type in the word transform and plug in the transform here. Automatically you would be able to move around your scene. Don't get me wrong, you can still move your stuff around your scene by just simply using all of this here, or using the controllers here, or using the gizmo that exists here. But then it doesn't make sense so much because it takes away the idea of it being procedural. So the best thing to do is be within your transform node, something like this. All right, be within your transform node and then select the object you want to manipulate and move it to whatever position you want it to be. We're going to jump back into the merge node so that we can see the both of them together. And then the next thing which we're going to do is try as much as possible to just simply scatter this around our scene. And so what we want to do now is we would like to create a scatter node. Okay, so a scatter node, you can just bring that out by typing and clicking the scatter, and then the scatter node appears. We're going to plug the scatter node over to the box because what we want to do is we want to scatter these spheres around the box. Okay, so I'm going to just simply position this here, and now you can see by default the scatter node has created a lot of points. Now these points are where your object will be copied to. So just in case you're wondering exactly, this is where your point, your object will be copied to. So how we want to copy this now is we may use a copy to point node. So I'm just going to type copy to point and bring it all the way out here, and I can plug this copy to point node here. And before you start playing with the copy to point, it's very necessary to actually know what node you want to use. This one says you have to plug in the primitive you want to copy. So we want to copy this primitive. Right now I'm going to just simply select this and position it by one side because we don't have use for it. Let me go ahead and also change this. So I'm going to just simply click this and drag it and drop there. And this other side says the target point you want to copy. So we want this to be our target point. So we want the point within the box to be the target point. And once we get that done, we have to turn on the flag, and there you're going to see we have a lot of things happening there. All of this sphere that you're seeing that has been created here are driven by the amount of scatters that we have. If you want to confirm that, you can go over to the properties menu here, or the inspector, depending on what you call it, you can go over here and then you can turn down the amount of points you have. So if I just simply turn the amount of points we have here, so let's just do that real quick, sorry. If I turn down the amount of points we have here, let's just take a peek. You would see I have basically a couple of points. So if I have 3 points here, if I just punch them up to a size like this, and go ahead and turn this on, you would see I have this number of points. You will still be wondering why we have a sphere this big. It's because when we selected the transform node, we only transformed this object to a side. Okay, we did not scale this object. So what I want to do now is just to simply add another transform node and use the transform node to simply scale this object. And Houdini has a certain set of scaling units. So if you come through and use the middle mouse, you will see all of the scaling unit that exist here. For now, we're going to use 0.1, and I'm going to scale this all the way down. By scaling this down, you would see that we have a very feasible feedback of what we have. And also, you're also going to notice that we have something that is called either the repo mesh if you're coming from Maya, or you can call it like the main mesh that instances all of these other meshes that you have here. So what we want to do now is just make sure that we have this within where it is, and we may want to see the box at the same time. So what we need to do is to merge them together. Hold Y on your keyboard just to cut any link you don't want, and if I turn on the merge, you would notice that I have the scatter node visible. I have the points that it has been scattered to, and if I just drag the box, I can have the box here as well. For now, looking at the scatter node might not be necessary because we don't see it in the viewport. So the best thing to do is just simply cut it out. So I'm just holding Y on my keyboard and I'm going to cut that out. And for any reason, if I don't want something within the scene or within my node, I can just select and press delete. So you've seen the idea of scatter node when you have to deal with a node-based system. So it scatters around the objects. You can still use this to actually fracture objects. You can use this to copy things to point. You can use this to actually direct a lot of things, especially when you're working with a node-based system like Houdini. Some other things that you can do with this is you can still use this to actually fracture a certain object. So we've taken a good look at this particular example which we have here. Now if I just simply hold down Alt on my keyboard, click and drag, I can make a copy of this, and we wouldn't want to see what we've created previously. So I'm just going to simply keep it one side and go ahead and position this inside node network. Now let's take a quick peek at how you can fracture objects still using the same scatter node. So for this, what we're going to do now is we're simply going to keep the scatter. All right, so I want to keep this scatter node. This is the box and I want to keep this scatter node. I'm going to go ahead and just simply cut this out, and because we don't need these anymore, I'm going to also cut this out as well. What we want to do is we want to create a number of scatters that we're going to use to just simply fracture our object. So for doing that, what we're going to look at is I'm going to simply connect this so that I can see the number of points that I have. And the next thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to bring out a fracture node. So for this, we're bringing out the Voroni fracture, and I'm going to position the Voroni fracture here. It's also worth saying that whenever you want to connect things together, you should always look at the node and see what suggestions it's giving us. For something like this, it is saying that we need to connect the points which we want, and this is going to ask for the geometry we want to fracture. So for the geometry, all we need to do is connect the box and then go ahead and connect these points directly here. Finally, the next thing which we may want to simply do is to click this, drag it all the way to this point and put it in the mesh. Because we don't want to see this, what we're going to do is we can just simply hold Y on our keyboard, click and cut. And by the way, if you are done with whatever you're doing and maybe there is no need for you to see the merge node, you can simply just cut it out and go ahead and just turn on the original flag. A good advice is whenever you're working with things like this, always try and keep a null node so that you can go ahead and just connect this. This null node will help you so that you don't go ahead, thinking or adding extra nodes, or maybe your node starts acting up, especially when it's going down the chain and there is nothing happening there. So the null node is more like an empty filter, or it's more like an empty node. Think about it like you are connecting a locator or a dummy or a null object to something that you want to use to make a certain control. So basically, this is how you can get started when working with scatter directly here in Houdini. The next thing which we're going to talk about is how you can work with scatter using an app like Clarisse. And because Clarisse, it's a very robust app, I would go ahead and show you how you can do that. For something like this that we have, that is Houdini, there are still other things that you can go ahead and play with. Say for example we want to explode this and you want to be able to see what you've created. You can always go down and create an explode node and drag in the explode node directly here, and with the explode node you can come through and see what you've created already. If this is something that appeals to you, I would advise you to go ahead and simply play with it. Now let's move on to Clarisse. The same idea that you have when working with Houdini is practically the same idea you get when working with Clarisse. And now I'm layering these things side by side is so that you can get a good understanding of how these things work. So Clarisse is by default an app that you use for your looks and development, and especially if you're into set dressing and let's say you're into landscape dressings as well. Now, one of the things that you may want to do, especially when working in Clarisse, is to try as much as possible to ease the computer's memory by replicating a lot of things. We're going to go ahead and simply do the same example which we had before, but now instead of using what we had, that is a sphere or a box, we're going to simply use a plane and then use a sphere to replicate that. So for Clarisse, there is something called a scatter. So you can use the scatter to actually drive the scatters or the objects you want. Now the basic idea about this is every single thing has a point, and then you can go ahead and work with those points. In some applications like Clarisse and like Maya as well, you may need to have segments that these things will scatter to. But apps like Cinema 4D and Houdini, they will automatically generate points for you to scatter objects around those certain points. And it's worth mentioning that before you go ahead and use apps like that, you need to be quite careful or know exactly what you want to create. In some instances, when you're working with apps like this and you have to say that the scatter doesn't do it for you, you can always go ahead and use the particles to actually drive what you want. So for this one, what we're going to do is go over to Clarisse and we're going to import a new geometry, and let's just start off with a polygrid. So this polygrid is something I'm going to go ahead and scale. Let's just scale this a little bit up, and within this part you're going to find out that I have different spans. So I would like to make this 6 of 6. So we can have a 6 of 6 span. Then the next thing which we're going to do is simply right click, go over to new, and then simply add the scatter node. Now this scatter node would not work properly if it doesn't have the points to scatter to and if it doesn't have the object is about to scatter. So for this, I'm going to simply go back to the geometry and come down to here and create a polysphere. A polysphere is just basically a sphere. Don't listen to the name called poly, it's actually polygon sphere. So for what we have here, I'm going to simply just drag this all the way up. And let's scale this down just a tiny bit and select the scatter node that you have here, or the scatter object you have here. We are going to support this geometry by adding this. So the geometry support that we want to actually use is the polygrid. I'm going to hit apply, and then the object that we want to scatter around this is actually something like this, which is the polysphere. And now you can see, because I transformed this polysphere all the way up, I have all the spheres created and they're all generated there. You can go ahead and position this wherever you want, and if you select the polygrid one more time and maybe make changes, and let's turn this down to 4x4, you notice that automatically this changes. This is something that is quite similar for those using mesh in Maya, and it's also something that is very similar for those using the clone objects that you have in Cinema, or the clone effectors that you have in Cinema 4D. And so because we've just talked about Cinema 4D, there are other things that you would want to take out of this. Contrary to Cinema 4D, where you can actually drive some of the scatters, or let's say drive a certain fracture by shaders, here you can actually drive a lot of things by using points. So we're going to look at how you can drive them by using points or volumes. So here I have a volume, so I'm just going to simply create a point volume, something like this. And then what I can do here is I can come through and just decide to say I want to increase the number of points that I have, or let's say increase how dense this volume is. You can simply do all of that, and once you're done, you can, let's say we go through here and decide to change this from box to something like that. I can increase the number of counts which I want my box to have, and now you can see I have something quite similar to what we have exactly in Houdini. Let me just jump back to Houdini so that you can have a look at what I'm saying. If I turn this on, and let's say I just simply turn this on as it is, you can see the number of points that we have here. The same thing is what we can get when working in Clarisse. So because I have this number of points here, I can also come through and just simply increase the size of the entire sphere. So let's say I can make this 10 by 10, and then go ahead, go over to the scatter, and instead of this scatter to be driven by, let's say a plane, which is actually our polygrid, we can simply come through and change this from a polygrid to a point. And once I have this selected, you will see I have a lot of points scattered around, and these objects that are scattered based off the positions of this point. If I come over to the points volume and start turning this down, you would notice that I'm beginning to lose some geometries. I can turn this down and turn this all the way up. So you can see that there are various ways you can scatter things in these two apps, and you can see how similar they begin to look. We'll begin to digress a little bit over and over to things that will be more layered based, contrary to things that are a bit more procedural than what we have. So the next thing, or the next stop where we're going to hit, is Cinema 4D. So hitting Cinema 4D, I'm going to just simply drag it all the way in here so you can have a very cool view of the interface. So this is Cinema 4D, and what we want to do here is just play around and see how the scatter thing works. So for the scatter, I will just simply explain this in two ways. You can choose to scatter if you are trying to, let's say you want to create a motion graphic, okay, or let's say you just want to create some Voroni fracture, things like that uses scatter, and it's actually good for you to really know how this works. I will still tie the same examples with what I've done earlier so that you can have a very good understanding of how it works. We're going to start off with a simple cube, and what we want to do now is we want to actually go through and just simply create, let's say, a sphere. Now this sphere is what I'm going to still come through and scatter. So in Cinema 4D, you can actually navigate using the very industry standard navigation key. The same thing happens for all of these other apps. So here in Clarisse, there's actually the same industry standard navigation, and the same thing happens when you're working with Houdini, the same industry standard navigation. So these are basically industry standard, and this is how you can work with them. So I'm going to just simply come through and just play with this, and this is how you can rotate. Some people choose to use things like 1, 2, and 3 to move, but I think once you hold down Alt, your life may be a little bit more easier, especially with the navigation. So what we want to do now is to scatter all of these objects directly onto something like this, and just simply play with it and see what happens. And for you to rescale an object, you actually need to press T on your keyboard, and then you can be able to scale. Unlike Houdini and maybe other apps, there is no exact unit of scale. So the unit of scale, which I mean, is you cannot really calculate how much you can scale all the way down or scale all the way up, especially if you're just holding down a button and you're clicking and dragging. Here in Cinema 4D, the E is actually for the move, the R is actually for rotate, and you have the T, which is for scale. Then the next big thing which we're going to do is just simply scatter this around our object. So for me to scatter this around the object, I need to make this a clone. So for that clone to happen, you can choose to go over to MoGraph and simply create a cloner. And creating a cloner simply means it's going to go ahead and create a cloner out of this object. But now we want to actually clone this, so I'm just going to come through and create the cloner object directly with this one. So once I click on create cloners, now we don't get to see a lot of them. So what we can do here is I can simply just select this object which I want and position this object directly inside the cloner, and now we have a couple of cloners. Now a quick way you can simply play with this or get this done, let's go ahead and delete this, is by simply selecting the sphere, go over to this part where you have the MoGraph, hold down Alt on your keyboard and click, and automatically it's going to go ahead and create the cloner. Here we have only 3, so you can increase them, reduce them as much as you want. But we want to scatter over onto this object, and that is what we want, and that's our aim for today. So what we're going to do now is select this and switch this to object instead of linear. Switching this to object instead of linear gives us the ability to select the object where we want our clones to be applied, and then we can go ahead from there and do whatever we want. So the next thing I'm going to do is just click on this button which I have here and click directly onto this object, and there you go, I have my object scattered around this cube. And once you take a quick peek at this part where we have the cloner, okay, so once we have this cloner selected, once you take a quick peek at this part, you're going to see that they're all scattered around the vertex. But this is not what we want. We actually want to scatter around the surface or maybe around the edges. And once you want that, once we select surface, it's going to go ahead and scatter these around the surface, all right? And from this part, you can turn down or turn up how much you want. Depending on what you're going for, this is how you can get it done. If you want to save a selection or maybe make it attach itself to a selection, you can actually go ahead and create that selection here and save that particular selection and also get it down. If you want to see how that works, I can actually make a video for that sometime later. So let's move on to the next thing which you can do by just using a simple scatter. With this clone tool done, we are going to just simply select it, press the backspace on your keyboard to get it out of the way. And let's look at how you can scatter using a Voroni fracture. So we talked about Voroni fracture when we were dealing with Houdini. So if I come back here and just simply select, you're going to notice I have the Voroni fracture, and the next thing which we did was to simply explode it. Let's see how we can replicate exactly the same effect directly in Cinema 4D. So with Cinema 4D open and we having this, the next thing which we're going to do now is we will go over to the mode graph and then simply click on the Voroni fracture. But instead of simply doing that, I would advise that you create your own panels. You can see I have mine here. You can create your own panels like that, and once that's done, once you hold Alt on your keyboard and simply click, you can have a quick Voroni fracture happening here. Now your next question would be, how can you actually go ahead and art direct this thing, especially if there is certain things you want to fracture and let's say you don't want to fracture some of them? And that is actually a good question, because there are various ways you can drive this. You can choose to simply drive this based off a certain shader, or you can simply drive it based on a distribution source. So if you want to drive it, let's say you want to drive it using a shader, the best way to do that is you can come through and simply add a different shader here. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn this off. If you want to get more extensive videos about how you can play with the Voroni fracture, please put those things in the comment section and I will try my best as much as possible to get back to you guys. Now if I come through and just simply select this, and you're going to see I have custom shader. I can click here and select a given shader I want to use to drive this particular thing. So if I select anyone, let's just go through and find something. Let's say I select the cloud, for example. You can see the cloud automatically, you can see that here, the cloud automatically will go through and create this kind of scatter for me. So you can use the shaders to generate scatters. Now let's go ahead and see how we can, you know, play with this and see what happens. So because I have this here, let's just turn this off and turn this back on because my computer is beginning to swing into action. Okay, so because I have something like this here, you'll notice I have a certain number of points. So if you want to go ahead and increase this point, you can increase the seed or you can decrease the seed, and this would actually alter or change how this works. You can still do the same here. If you want a certain amount of points, you can still do that here. So the seed would just simply give you variations, while this would actually break it more into two. Like now I'm just having 3, and you can see I have just 1, 2, 3. And let's go ahead and just make this about 6. You can select and actually press 6 on your keyboard. And if you're wondering if you can go ahead and animate this, it is totally fine. You can actually animate. And in Cinema 4D, once you click on a button like this, you can have your animation started. So once we have something like this, what we want to do is to just simply replicate the explode. So the explode can be done in a kind of, should I say, much more simplified pattern, or maybe a much more not so procedural pattern, but either way it works. So how you can get this done is if you go back to the objects which we have here, and let's say we simply select on an object, all right? You select the Voroni fracture, select the object you want. You can turn on the offset fragment and you can get something like this. All right, so you can turn this on and you can get something like this. Another way you can get this object to fracture is if you decide to drive this object using dynamics. So what do I mean by driving this object using dynamics? If I come through and just simply create a plane and right click here and choose to add this object into a rigid body. So let's go ahead and try and create dynamics here. So I'm going to make this a collider body. So it's just going to be a collider, and I can select this object and actually come through and make this object a rigid body. So if I make this object a rigid body and simply press the playback button, you can see I can get a quick fracture directly here. And if you need more segments, you can simply come through and change the number of points you have, and that would actually change how much of the animation you get. So let's just simply take this all the way up and get a quick playback. I think this might be a bit slower. And there you go. So this is basically how you can go ahead and create scatter on or with these apps. I would like to talk about that of Maya, but I think we've already gone past about 25 minutes, which I think is a little bit too lengthy for a video that just wants to teach you how to get things within their basic state. If you want me to talk more about this stuff, or let's say you want me to cover that of Maya, please put that in the comment section below. I will do my best to cover that as quick and as soon as possible. And maybe if you have questions about what I've talked about today or things that you've seen, please ask those questions within the comment section, and I would also try my best as possible to get back to you guys on how you can, you know, play with it. If you want to see this in Maya and maybe in 3D Studio Max, please tell me so that I can go ahead and put this. I wouldn't like my videos to get way longer than 25 minutes, and I think it's gonna bore you guys a bit more if it's way longer than this. And just simply tell me what you guys want in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you with that. And if you like this video, simply give it a like, and don't forget to share with your friends. I would also like to ask a couple of questions. If you guys have tried these things before, if you have an idea, and if you want to have more ideas about this, tell me what you guys think about this in the comment section below, and I would like to hear from you. And until I see you guys next time with a review, tutorial, updates, tips and tricks, free Friday, things like this, peace.